Hello and welcome to this video. Today we have Dr. Collins to talk about design arguments on this channel. This carries on with our introductory series to arguments for the existence of God. So if you're interested in design arguments, this is the video for you. We're going to be introducing what design arguments are, some of the arguments for, and some of the arguments against. Dr. Collins, how are you?
I'm pretty good.
So Dr. Collins is the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Messiah University, and he specializes in the field of philosophy of religion, especially design art and fine-tuning arguments. So it's a great privilege to have him on this channel. So to start off with, what are design arguments?
Design arguments are arguments from the apparent structure of the universe or some part of the universe that looks like it's for some end, so that it be something that would be seemingly difficult to be explained by chance.
So I suppose design arguments have quite a long history, and I suppose have a lot of different formulations. If someone's perhaps talking to their teacher or talking to their Sunday school teacher, they might first get introduced to a design argument along the lines of, well, why does God exist? Oh, look at the trees. The trees are so beautiful. And someone might, of course, if they're starting to read into the literature, be exposed to different more objections and criticisms to that, and there are more developed arguments against design arguments and formulations of design arguments. What would you say are some of the different formulation of these design arguments?
So one that goes in the West and also in the Hinduism, the Indian tradition that goes back to ancient times, was about the order of the universe, and it apparently seems to be in some sense ordered for an end. And so that same argument then in the West is given by Thomas Aquinas. It's like his fifth way to the existence of God. And then the next big kind of development of the design argument is William Paley in the in the 19th century, around 1800, in his Natural Theology. And there the focus is mostly on the intricate structure of plant and animal life. So there was during that period of development of anatomy, and like when you look at the heart or the eye, it seems very intricately put together for a purpose of seeing or pumping blood. And so it'd be difficult to explain that by chance. And then, of course, along came Darwin's theory of evolution, which kind of undercut that argument because there was an alternative explanation to chance, namely chance and natural selection, which a lot of people thought was a plausible alternative. So then the next big development is the fine-tuning of the cosmos, which I'll be talking more about, how the cosmos itself, which is the universe, is very finely structured for the existence of life initially. Then I've extended that to scientific discovery. So there we're talking about the universe as a whole instead of some aspect of the universe. So evolution itself can't touch that argument. Now, there has been other evolutionary versions of it connected with the intelligent design movement, like Michael Behe's claim that certain systems in the body are irreducibly complex and could not be accounted for by an evolutionary process, or Stephen Myers about the initial cell, that there's no good way of accounting for it on naturalistic grounds. And then throughout, especially there's been philosophical criticisms of the argument besides the appeal to Darwinian evolution, and David Hume is most well known for that. So that's kind of a real brief sketch of the history of it.
So there seems to be perhaps three kind of main strands. There's the Aquinas kind of teleological argument, I suppose, looking at ends, and then there's the intricate structures of Paley, and now it seems to move on to the fine-tuning arguments. Would you say that at the present day in modern kind of discourse, that all three of them still play a major role in modern discourse, or have some of them kind of fallen out of modern popularity, perhaps, and it's mainly focused on fine-tuning?
The intricate structure of plants and animal life largely fallen out of favor, for at least among intellectuals, because it seems to be, at least whether you believe in Darwinian evolution or not, it seems explicable by Darwinian evolution. And so the revival, a lot of people don't buy the revival of it by the intelligent design movement. So, but it's much more widely accepted, the fine tuning. So probably the big focus is on the fine tuning. I didn't mention another one that I think is actually needs more development, and that's just the plain order of the universe as reflected in the laws of nature and the mathematical structure. Those could all be kind of combined a little bit into fine tuning, but they have been around too. But I think those could be more developed.
Perhaps developing on kind of this difference, what would you say are the main differences between a fine-tuning argument, a design argument, or I suppose design is an intricate structure argument, and the teleological argument, I suppose. What would you say were the biggest differences between them?
Well, the biggest difference is what the focus of
Mhm,
apparent design is, and the one on the universe as a whole is not subject to a Darwinian
mhm,
explanation,
mhm,
and it also is not it's quantifiable in a way that the others are not, because you can look at what happens when you change a parameter, and parameters are just numbers in physical equations.
mhm,
So, and there also isn't as clear of a particular end, except for the existence of intelligent life in the
mhm,
fine tuning one.
mhm. Perhaps what would you say are the major criticisms of design argument in the present day?
Oh, I mean, you'd have to look at one. I mean, I think the biggest one that shows up often is, well, you're no better off invoking God
Mhm,
than just accepting the apparent design of the universe as a brute given, because the idea is the designer of an artifact would have to be just as fine tuned as the artifact itself. Like in the case of human beings, when we design something, if we design a watch, well, we're a lot more fine tuned, our brain is, than the watches have a lot more organized complexity, as they put it. So that's one of the big ones. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones that get into very specific, what particular design argument you're talking about. And another very general one is they don't get you, all the way to God. Well, why couldn't you have, um, you know, a, a bunch of different finite designers, etc.? So how do you get to the
mhm.
theistic God from there?
So would you say a lot of them are still inspired by, I suppose, Hume's arguments against natural theology, against the design argument? Do you think Hume still plays a very major
Yeah,
influence on
it
philosophy?
still plays a big role, right? I mean, one of them, who designed God, what I call the who designed God objection, which I just articulated, being the most, common one, goes back to David Hume. And then whether you have an indifferent designer versus the designer of theism is another one. Why not just an indifferent designer? It's morally indifferent to us.
What would you say are some of the major responses that a theist can give if they were proposing a design argument? I suppose what would
Well,
be something they could say?
I deny, the one I give on the who designed the God objection, which I consider the strongest objection, is to just design arguments in general, is
Mhm,
that only works if the being is, by hypothesis, made of parts. And so the parts have to be put together in the right way
mhm,
in order for it to um, be able to bring things about. But traditionally, theists have always held that God is not made of parts. So there's nothing to fine tune in God. And there's not even fine tuning of God's basic attributes, because they're all unbounded. So you don't even have a fine tuning that applies there. So, like
mhm,
a picture of, if you have a picture of Abraham Lincoln, or I guess, Boris Johnson, you being over in England, made of ink, ink spots, um,
mhm,
those they would need those ink spots would need fine tuning to give you a coherent picture of,
mhm.
some well-known person, because they're all little parts that have to be arranged in just the right way, but not so with God. So first of all, there's no fine tuning. It's inapplicable to God. So it's what they call a red herring. The real issue is whether it's plausible for there to be such a being that doesn't need fine tuning, that's infinite in the being's attributes, for instance, that just a kind of unbounded consciousness and will is the way you could think about it. So it's a misdirected criticism.
Perhaps moving a bit beyond the who caused God argument, I suppose, again, or
It's who
criticism of the
designed
fine
God,
who
because
designed God.
who caused God would be more the objection against the cosmological
Yes.
argument.
So I suppose developing on that, or perhaps changing a bit to other objections of the fine tuning argument. If someone came back and said, well, perhaps the universe just had to be this way, there was almost this brute fact nature of the universe, and said, well, actually, the universe is just the way it is. How would someone go around responding to perhaps someone trying to bite the bullet against the fine tuning argument?
Well, it depends on. There's two sorts of things positions you're taking. Let me just distinguish between the two. One is the brute fact idea, just a brute fact. It's just the way it is, and there's no further explanation. Well, that seems enormously improbable. I mean, in the sense that there's all these look like equally good alternatives, just an enormous number of them, and there's only this one small range, for example, of parameters that will yield intelligent life. And our usual way we proceed there is we look for an explanation. I mean, this is common in science, like why did the atomic theory eventually win over when there was skepticism about it around 1900. A lot of scientists were skeptical. It was because under atomic theory, their atomic theory made sense of these, there was 14 different methods of finding Avogadro's number, and they all yielded the same result. And that made sense under atomic theory, but without atomic theory, it would have been a huge coincidence, just enormous coincidence. And so the argument was, well, that greatly confirms atomic theory, because atomic theory takes away the coincidence. And so we generally want to explain those coincidences. That's one way you can go in. You can formulate that in terms of Bayesian formulation, that, in the atomic theory case, if atomic theory was false, then it'd be very unlikely that all these different methods of finding Avogadro's number would yield the same result. But if atomic theory is true, it's not improbable at all. So then Bayes' theorem, which is a theorem from the probability calculus, says that evidence that those all came together would, in same number, would greatly confirm atomic theory over its opposite. And we see that same kind of reasoning going on in the courtroom. That's why DNA evidence or fingerprint evidence counts in favor of guilt, because the idea is if the person was innocent, it'd be very unlikely that the fingerprints they find on the gun would match their fingerprints. It's possible that somebody else with nearly identical fingerprints could have touched the gun, but very unlikely, where it's not unlikely if the defendant is guilty. And so that's the basis of the inference to guilt over innocence in those cases. So same thing is going on in the case of the fine-tuning argument, I think.
I suppose when someone might be objecting to the fine-tuning argument, or a theist might be trying to approach the fine-tuning argument, they might be initially thinking that it's something which is quite simple. However, I suppose if they're listening to this video, they hear things like Bayesian probability and other things like that. Do you think there's a more simple way for someone to kind of get their head around what actually are these fine-tuned probabilities, or is it something which is actually something which is very complex and something that perhaps someone in the street might prefer not to get muddled up in, perhaps?
Well, the real simple idea is that the universe has fine-tuning means, just the normal language, things have to be precisely set. So in the case of the cosmological constant, which governs the expansion rate of the universe, the typical estimate in the physics literature is 1 part in 10 followed by 123 zeros, enormously precisely set. So whenever we find something enormously precisely set like that, we say that would just be way too improbable on chance. So we look for some explanation, and the explanation kind of stares us in the face here is that some intelligent being, God, set that. So in that way, it provides evidence for, it's very strong evidence for the existence of God. It'd be like, if you had a car that to get, that the fuel, the air mixture was just precisely set, let's say 1 part in 1,000 to get optimized fuel economy, and you looked in the car and it was set there, you wouldn't just think that happened by accident. You would think that, the engineer set it that way. And especially if it was like 1 in a million, then you'd say, certainly it's not by accident. But here it's not, way more fine-tuned than 1 in a million. That would be the simple way of thinking about it in terms of analogies. But then if you get more, you can get more, to answer objections, and it's nice to philosophically make it more sophisticated argument that's based on things that are even more secure, like the probability calculus, to kind of get to the bottom of what's going on in the argument.
I suppose if one might be talking to an atheist, the atheist might say something along the lines of, well, I suppose with the situation of the car or with these analogies, we have experience of already a designer existing or an engineer existing. But with the universe, it kind of is just, we never had any experience of any other universe or any other probabilities. And I suppose this ties back to the brute force argument a bit, but how would you go around responding to the suggestion that what we experience, what we view as probabilities, are often something which is experienced alongside a lot of other events, whereas when it comes to the whole universe as a whole, we don't really see any other universes out there to come to any conclusion?
Well, I mean, so I would deny on very good grounds that you need this prior experience. I think that's bogus. Because look at the case of atomic theory, we had no prior experience of whether those Avogadro's number, we didn't look at it, find a universe in which Avogadro's number didn't match, and then found a whole bunch of them in which they don't match, those 14 ways of testing it. And then the one it matched is one in which atoms exist. And there's all kinds of other cases in science, like quantum electrodynamics predicted what's called the geomagnetic moment of the electron to because 9 significant digits. And we take that as strong evidence for quantum electrodynamics, but we had no prior experience with that. That was the first time. So to think that you have to have a prior experience, like, toss a coin many, many times to get its probability of something occurring, it's just not how confirmation works in science. So if they want to argue that, then let's throw out the inferences to atomic theory as a confirmation. All those cases you can look at in science. And I think if they're unwilling to do that, then they should drop the criticism in this case.
If you've been enjoying this video so far and you like this interview, then make sure you go check out my blog and my newsletter after this video so you can stay up to date with all my insights, all my updates, and all my notices about people I'm going to interview, the topics I'm going to be discussing and wrestling with. So if you want to just stay up to date with everything I'm doing right now, be it for this YouTube channel or in academics or anything else, then make sure you go check out my blog and my newsletter. The link to that will be in the description below, so you can check it out after the video. Of course, make sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you can stay up to date with all the content that I upload here. Without further ado, let's carry on with the interview.
So I suppose I'm taking a step back from some of the criticisms. What would you say are the main strengths for why someone who might be trying to defend the existence of God, or someone who might be wrestling with the existence of God, why someone might be drawn to or might be convinced by the fine-tuning argument?
Well, first of all, it's a very intuitive argument. So it just transfers our normal inferences that we do when we find, like I mentioned with the car, that fine-tuned, fuel to air ratio that you get in for the carburetor, or when we find a watch, we don't just like we found a watch on Mars, or like an alarm clock. We wouldn't just say it happened by chance. Let's say metals got together, some volcanic eruption just gotten just the structure that made an alarm clock, or a building, right? Because it would be too unlikely. So all these cases we have of ordinary inference. So what we do is we're just applying it to the universe as a whole. So there's a huge intuitive basis for this argument. It's easy to understand, and that's why Richard Dawkins, said, but with the one, Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, said this at least about Paley's argument from the complexity of animal and plant life. It was that argument before Darwin's theory of evolution made it impossible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So that's one reason, the intuitive nature of it. But I also think it's philosophically has an advantage over like cosmological and other arguments, is the cosmological argument at best gets you to a necessary being. Then the step that necessary being is personal, I think, is much more difficult to make. Whereas, and we also don't have, I think there's less intuition behind it. Whereas in this case, it immediately gets you to an intelligent being. And then I think it can get you a lot further, because it's not just an intelligent being. If you require that the intelligence you're invoking does not transfer the fine tuning up one level, that you're explaining the fine tuning of the universe by invoking something else. Well, that thing you invoke better not require the same amount of fine tuning. Well, in that case, I think it ends up getting you to an unbounded being. So my way of doing this is you kind of start with something like this: is either consciousness is fundamental to nature, the universe, or the consciousness which involve the personal, or what's ultimate is unconscious, like matter. And so then you have two ways of going. If you go the route of consciousness, then if consciousness is fundamental, the basic thing, then there'd be nothing else to bound the consciousness. So it makes the most sense to think that consciousness is unbounded. And so it'd be unbounded knowledge, know everything, because it's knowledge should be unbounded. Its will is unbounded. So you get automatically, naturally comes out of that omniscience and omnipotence. And because of that, you don't have any fine tuning that enters in. And so I think you can get pretty close to the God of theism. You could even get, I think, to the perfect goodness of God, because I think thesis going back to Plato is that somebody who knows the good at least is motivated to do it, just to acknowledge the good. So if God knows something is good, God is motivated by that to do it. So the only reason people don't do the good, if they recognize something to be good, is that they have some other contrary desire. But if God's unbounded, God would be perfectly free. There's nothing to give God a contrary desire. Like in our case, we have other desires. We're finite beings. We have sexual desires that might, weigh in. We know we shouldn't do this, commit adultery. We know that's bad, but we do it anyhow because we have this contrary desire. But that wouldn't be the case with God. So there'd be no conflicting desire. It'd be all the good would be self-motivating, which means God's desires would always be directed towards the good, which makes God perfectly good. So you actually get a being just from those arguments, I think, that is omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good, just from that fine-tuning argument. So you actually get a long ways towards a personal God of theism.
Yes. I suppose in response to the idea about the good, someone might raise, well, if God was motivated to the good, then perhaps what should one say about evil? Or I suppose it's the problem of evil, but formulated more directly towards a fine-tuning argument, I suppose. How would one go around responding to that and explain the existence of evil in the world?
Well, what I do is I do a kind of Bayesian formulation of this. I say that, okay, so we have two choices. I call beings like us highly vulnerable embodied conscious agents. So that's what we observe. Why vulnerable embodied conscious agents? I mean ones that are vulnerable to both natural and moral evil. So, atheists and theists admit that once you grant the existence of such beings, then that's going to account for the evil in the world, right? Because if we're vulnerable beings to doing moral evil, then, it's likely we're going to do moral evil. So now shifting the question, it becomes, given that fact, it's highly improbable under atheism that such beings would exist because the existence of such beings themselves require an enormous fine tuning. But so that's a probability under atheism, but it's not highly improbable under theism because we can glimpse a reason for why God would allow that. There's something valuable about being able to, let's say, exercise courage. I've developed a connection building theodicy. You don't have to go with my connection building theodicy, but as long as you can glimpse some viable reason that renders it not highly improbable, then that fact is not highly improbable under theism, but enormously improbable under naturalism, excluding the multiverse hypothesis, we'd have to discuss separately. Therefore, it strongly confirms theism over naturalism. So that's how I approach it.
I suppose you've said the multiverse hypothesis should be discussed separately, but perhaps now that you've raised it, a viewer might find it very confusing or a bit worried about this multiverse hypothesis. Would it be possible if you summarize it very quickly? Or?
So the multiverse, there's two aspects to what needs to be explained through the fine-tuning for life, is why there exists a life-permitting universe, okay, at all, given how, everything has to be adjusted just right, and then why we find ourselves as kind of generic embodied conscious agents in such a universe. So let's start with the first one. The first one, the idea is if there is enough universes and the fundamental structure of the universe varies from universe to universe, then eventually there's going to be one that is just right for intelligent life to occur, even if it's enormously improbable. Think of a lottery ticket. If the lottery generating machine generates enough tickets, eventually one will be the winning number. So if you have enough universes, or the usual hypothesis is some underlying physical process does it. It generates these universes, and some of the fundamental parameters vary from universe to universe. Eventually, you're going to get one where it's just right. Okay, and then the second part of it is important. Why do we find ourselves in such a one that's just right for life? Well, we couldn't have found ourselves anywhere else because none of them could have given rise to observers. So there's no coincidence left to be explained. And often it's used to make this intuitive to people. It's often used why do we find ourselves in a planet that has just the right distance from the sun? I think if we were too far from the sun, we'd go into a ice age that would never end, and so we wouldn't really exist very early on. If we were too close, all the water would boil off. So why are we just the right distance from the sun? Well, the idea is if there's enough planets, we got a real big universe, eventually one's going to be just the right distance from the sun. And then among those that are just the right distance from the sun, eventually life will evolve on one of those planets. And then, of course, that life is going to find itself on a planet just right from distance from the sun because it couldn't find itself anywhere else. It couldn't find itself on a planet like Mercury or Jupiter because it couldn't have existed there. So that's the multiverse explanation.
So how would someone go around responding to it, or how would someone go around providing a theistic hypothesis which is more convincing?
Okay, so one of the problems with the multiverse, if you take the universe generator version, is it looks like the universe generator, whatever's generating this physical process, has to be fine-tuned not only to create the universes, but to vary the fundamental parameters from universe to universe, and in order to generate this multiverse. And I give an analogy like a bread machine, which I used to have, to even produce one decent loaf of bread, it has to have the right program, the right ingredients. So if you actually look into the proposals for these multiverse generators, they have to be adjusted just right, have the right initial conditions and laws of nature to produce these universes. So it really doesn't fully eliminate the fine tuning. It just kind of pushes it back one level. So that's one objection. Another really hugely discussed objection is the Boltzmann brain objection. And that is, at least for the why we have the mass energy, why its order is so very precise at the beginning of the universe. That's an enormous precision. It particularly deals with that. And under that is that if you try to explain that as just a chance fluctuation, then it's far, 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 far more likely we would exist as isolated brains that only existed for a short amount of time with chaos everywhere else. But that's not what we observe. So it's contrary to our observation. And then my further development of all this is the fine-tuning for scientific discovery. And that cannot be explained by the multiverse, because even though a universe might exist where it's, which certainly exists where it's really optimal for scientific discovery, given enough of them, it's very unlikely we would find ourselves in such a universe, because all the other ones that are life permitting but are not very good for scientific discovery would exist. So why don't we find ourselves in one of those? So that second kind of fine-tuning or coincidence, why do we find ourselves in such a good universe, a certain kind of universe, is not eliminated in the case of the fine-tuning for scientific discovery.
Definitely. Perhaps someone coming into fine-tuning arguments right now might be curious as to where the current academia or the current discussion in fine-tuning arguments surrounds, or what they're debating right now. What would you say are the current questions, the big questions in fine-tuning discourse at the present moment?
Well, there is the questions of the physics questions, what parameters are really fine-tuned, and can we explain, ultimately be able to explain those, like entropy. There's been a lot of proposals, none of which seem to work, on trying to explain the extremely low entropy of the beginning of the universe. That's one. So the physics questions. And like you interviewed Luke Barnes on this, well, a lot of the, we have a massive amount of different physics reasons to believe there is fine-tuning. Even if one of them we can eventually explain, well, there's still a whole bunch of other ones. And the deeper we dig, the more fine-tuning we find. So that seems, I think, is answered in favor of the fine-tuning advocate. The other is the philosophical questions. And so does this really, what's the nature of probability? How do you assess the probability here? All those kind of who designed God objection, all those kind of objections I mentioned. And that's where, my previous work, big published article on that in the Blackwell Companion in Natural Theology on the fine-tuning, it tries to address those questions. Now, another kind of fine-tuning, which really hasn't been really picked up on that much, is the fine-tuning for scientific discovery. It's been discussed under the intelligibility of the universe, like by Eugene Wigner, which you can find easily on the internet. He's one of the founders of quantum mechanics. The unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and the physical sciences, easy to find, just type it in. And Einstein, who noticed this, the most miraculous thing about the universe is it's intelligible at all. But that's all on the intelligibility or the ability of us to discover the laws of nature. So what I've advanced this, and I'm completing a project on this, is the fine-tuning of the parameters of physics. And no one has addressed this for their discoverability. So if it was really the laws were constructed to be discovered, if there was some providential ordering, then you'd think that would show up in the fundamental parameters. So if you change the parameters, then you would expect things to either stay the same for ability to discover the universe or get worse. And I think I've got enough data now to show that they actually get worse, and it's quite fine-tuned for that. So that would be the very cutting edge. But all that physical arguments have got to get out there. So that's what most other people are talking about.
Definitely. So perhaps to end off this interview, what would you say are the top 5-6 books on design arguments? What would be some of the best books that people could read, or articles that people could read to get into fine-tuning arguments if they want to learn more about it beyond this video?
Well, there's books on, first of all, the fine-tuning itself. And Luke Barnes, I would put number one recommendation on that book, The Fortunate Universe. So that's number one. There's also one by Martin Rees, Just Six Numbers, which is a good one, pretty accessible. Those I'd put the top two and any references therein. Duke Barnes is the most recent. In terms of design arguments as a whole, it's more articles, I would think. And there you just have to look into the literature. I published a fair amount on that, but then there's people that, raise objection. Some of them I don't think are very good objections, but there is a whole literature out there on that, mostly coming out in article form.
Definitely.
So that's where I'd be at on recommendations and accessible ones. If you things that occur in philosophy of religion, readers often will give kind of overviews or pull out some of them from the literature.
So I hope you've enjoyed this interview with Dr. Robin Collins. It was great to have him onto the channel to discuss such an important and influential argument in the history of the philosophy of religion sphere. If you enjoyed this content and want more interviews, then make sure to like and subscribe and let me know what you want in the comments below. I'll happily hear your thoughts there. Also, if you want to support our channel financially, then make sure that you check out our Patreon, which will give you exclusive access to newsletters, different works I'm working on, exclusive access to copies of essays I'm writing, and much more. So make sure you go check that out. So like always, stay safe, my friends. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Stay safe. See you soon. Thank you for watching, and God bless. I'll see you in the next one.